You're listening to The Missing Why. People will tell you what they did. Some will even tell you how they did it. But the why is almost always edited or buried because the real reasons are rarely clean. They're shaped by fear, by ambition, by ego, by pressure that never makes it into the story. Every decision leaves a trace. Every action exposes a pattern. And most people spend their lives hoping no one looks closely enough to connect them. This is where we do. We study the fracture points, the contradictions, the quiet motives operating behind composed language and controlled appearances. Because beneath every polished narrative, there is something else. And once you see it, you don't unsee it.
Welcome to this special compilation episode of The Missing Why. In this collection, we're bringing together several cases that all forces us to sit with the same uncomfortable question. What happens when the truth is present, but the reason remains buried? Each story stands on its own, but together they reveal a deeper pattern of human behavior, silence, violence, psychology, and consequence. This is not just about what happened. It's about what was missing underneath it. Let's begin.
The house did not scream. That may be the most disturbing part. No broken windows. No forced door. No frantic witnesses running into the street. No stranger vanishing into the summer heat. Just a house on 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts. A respectable house. A controlled house. A house where people knew how to speak properly, sit properly, receive guests properly, and keep certain emotions hidden behind locked doors. On August 4th, 1892, Andrew Borden came home from his morning errands and lay down on the sitting room sofa. He was a wealthy man, but not a man who lived like wealth wanted to be seen. He had money, property, and standing, but he kept his family in a modest house near the business district, not among the elite homes on the hill. Upstairs, his wife, Abby Borden, had already been killed. Downstairs, Andrew would soon be killed too. And in the house that morning were not many people. There was Bridget Sullivan, the Irish maid. There was Lizzie Borden, Andrew's 32-year-old daughter. And there was a silence so thick that more than a century later, America is still trying to cut through it. This is not just a story about an axe. It is a story about repression, about inheritance, about what happens when a family becomes a closed system, and about the terrible possibility that sometimes the most dangerous room in the world is the one where everyone is pretending everything is fine. This is The Missing Why, and this is Lizzie Borden The house that couldn't speak. Most people know the rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. And when she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. But the rhyme is wrong. Abby Borden was not Lizzie's mother. She was her stepmother. The weapon is often described as a hatchet rather than a full axe. And the number of blows was exaggerated by folklore. But folklore rarely cares about precision. Folklore cares about what a story feels like. And the Lizzie Borden case feels like something America never fully resolved. Not because the court failed to speak. The court did speak. Lizzie Borden was acquitted. Legally, she was not convicted of killing Andrew and Abby Borden. But culturally, something else happened. The public turned the case into a permanent question. Could a respectable woman from a prominent New England family commit such violence? Could a daughter kill her father? Could a woman trained in politeness, religion, restraint, and social presentation do something so physically brutal? Or was the entire accusation an act of class anxiety, gender panic, and poor investigation? That is why this case survives. Not because we lack facts, but because the facts do not relieve the pressure. They intensify it. The murder happened inside the home. The violence was intimate. The family had tension. The evidence was incomplete. The accused was acquitted. And the house remained standing there, holding what the living could not prove. To understand the Borden murders, you have to understand Fall River. In the late 19th century, Fall River was a textile city, a mill city, a place of industry, money, labor, immigration, religious division, and class pressure. It was a city where old Protestant families watched newer immigrants' communities rise around them. It was also a city where social status mattered, where you lived mattered, what church you attended mattered, who came to your home mattered, how your family appeared mattered. Andrew Borden had money. He was involved in business, property, banks, and local power. He was not a poor man, but he did not live in the way his daughters may have believed a wealthy man should live. The Bordens lived at 92 2nd Street, later renumbered 230, 2nd Street. It was not poverty, but it was not the hill. The hill was where status displayed itself more openly. Bigger homes, better air, greater distance from the crowded movement of commerce, immigrants, and working class life. For Lizzie Borden, that difference mattered. She was 32 years old, unmarried, socially visible, involved in her church and charitable circles, and yet still living under her father's roof. That matters psychologically, because the Borden house was not just a residence, it was a container, a structure where adult daughters remained dependent, where money was present but controlled, where social ambition had a ceiling, where family conflict had nowhere clean to go, and where the person with the financial power was also the person whose approval shaped the future. Andrew Borden controlled the money. Abby Borden occupied the role of wife and stepmother. Emma, Lizzie's older sister, was away on the day of the murders. Bridget Sullivan worked inside the home as the servant, known in the household as Maggie. And Lizzie was there, a grown daughter in a respectable house, a woman with social standing, but not full independence, a woman whose public image said restraint, but whose private life may have contained resentment no one fully understood until it was too late. The Borden household was not a warm mythology of Victorian domestic peace. It was more complicated. Lizzie and Emma were Andrew's daughters from his first marriage to Sarah Morse Borden. Sarah died when Lizzie was very young. Andrew later married Abby Gray. For years, Abby held the position of stepmother. But in family systems, titles do not automatically create attachment. A stepmother can be called mother without being experienced as mother. A daughter can obey without feeling loyalty. A house can appear orderly without being emotionally stable. Reports from the case suggest that Lizzie and Emma had financial tensions with Andrew and Abby. At some point, Lizzie stopped calling Abby mother and referred to her as her stepmother. That is not a small linguistic shift. In a restrained family, language often carries what people are not permitted to say directly. She is not my mother. That sentence is not just clarification. It is separation. It is a refusal to merge roles. It is an emotional boundary dressed up as accuracy. And the inheritance structure matters here. Andrew's money was not abstract. It represented freedom, movement, status, the possibility of leaving Second Street, the possibility of becoming what Lizzie may have believed she already deserved to be. But as long as Andrew lived, Andrew controlled the future. As long as Abby lived, Abby occupied a protected position inside that future. This is where the case becomes psychologically dangerous, because no one needs to be openly screaming for a family system to become violent. Sometimes the most volatile systems are the quiet ones, the ones where resentment has no language, the ones where dependency humiliates adults, the ones where money replaces affection, the ones where people maintain the image of family long after the emotional structure underneath has decayed. That is the Borden house as a psychological object, not a haunted house, a pressurized house. The morning of August 4th, 1892, began with ordinary movements: breakfast, housework, errands, summer heat. Bridget Sullivan had been unwell. Abby and Andrew had reportedly experienced stomach sickness in the days before. There had been talk of possible poisoning, although that was never proven as the mechanism of death. John Morse, Lizzie's maternal uncle, had stayed at the house the night before. He left that morning. Emma was away. Andrew left the home to conduct business. Abby remained inside. Bridget was doing work around the house. Lizzie was also there. At some point in the morning, Abby went upstairs. She was killed in the guest room. The violence was not distant. It was not clean. It was not symbolic in the mild sense. It was repeated. Overkill matters psychologically. Overkill does not automatically identify a killer, but it does tell us something about the emotional quality of the act. This was not a single fatal strike meant only to eliminate. This was destruction. The body was attacked beyond necessity. That kind of violence often raises the question of personal meaning. Not always, but often. Then time passed. And this is one of the strange horrors of the case. Abby was dead upstairs, while the household continued below. A murdered woman lay in the house, and the house did not announce it. Andrew returned around 11 in the morning. He was let inside. He eventually lay down on the sitting room sofa. Then he too was killed. Again, the violence was concentrated on the head and face. Again, the body became the site of obliteration. Then Lizzie called out. Bridget came. Andrew was dead. At first, Abby's body had not yet been found. Think about that. In the same house, one body is discovered, while another remains hidden upstairs. The crime scene is not only physical, it is spatial. Upstairs and downstairs. Stepmother and father. First killing and second killing. Concealed death and discovered death. A home divided vertically. A family divided emotionally. And in the middle of it all, the question that will not die. Who could move through that house with enough familiarity, enough access, enough confidence, and enough invisibility to kill twice in daylight? At first, suspicion did not settle cleanly on Lizzie. That matters. Because the assumptions of the era shaped what people could imagine. A brutal double murder suggested a man, maybe an intruder, maybe a foreigner, maybe someone from outside the respectable family structure. That assumption tells us as much about the society as it does about the investigation. Violence was gendered. Respectability was gendered. Innocence was gendered. The public could imagine a violent outsider more easily than it could imagine a church-going woman from a prominent family. But the house created a problem. There were no obvious signs of robbery. No confirmed fleeing stranger. No clean outside explanation. And Lizzie's statements drew attention. Her answers shifted. Her emotional presentation was scrutinized. She had reportedly tried to purchase prussic acid the day before the murders, although that evidence became legally complicated. A dress was burned, described as stained with old paint. For those who suspected Lizzie, these details looked like consciousness of guilt. For those who defended her, they were fragments being arranged into a story the evidence could not fully prove. This is one of the reasons the Lizzie Borden case remains so powerful. It lives in the gap between suspicion and certainty. There are facts that feel meaningful, but feeling is not verdict. There are behaviors that look strange, but strange is not proof. There is motive like architecture, but architecture is not confession. That gap is where public mythology grows. Because the human mind hates unresolved pressure. It wants a shape. It wants a villain. It wants the house to finally tell us what happened. But houses do not testify. People do. And when people contradict themselves, conceal themselves, protect themselves, or perform themselves, the truth becomes harder to separate from the image. Lizzie Borden was arrested. The case moved into the legal system. And by the time of the trial, it was no longer only about two murders. It was about womanhood, class, religion, ethnicity, power, and the question of what kind of person society was willing to see as capable of violence. The prosecution had problems. No definitive murder weapon. No bloody clothing conclusively tying Lizzie to the killings. No eyewitnesses to the act. Evidence that suggested suspicion, but not necessarily legal certainty. The defense had advantages. Lizzie had standing. She had supporters. She had access to strong legal representation. And she had the benefit of a cultural assumption that worked in her favor. A woman like this could not do a thing like that. This is the paradox of the case. The same Victorian constraints that may have trapped Lizzie inside a narrow life also helped shield her from conviction. She was viewed through the mythology of respectable femininity. Delicate, moral, religious, controlled. Not physically or morally capable of such brutality. That does not mean she was guilty. It means the trial was not only evaluating evidence, it was evaluating imagination. Could the jury imagine Lizzie Borden as a killer? Could they imagine a woman from her class committing patricide? Could they imagine the violence coming from inside the family rather than outside the door? The answer, legally, was no. On June 20th, 1893, Lizzie Borden was acquitted. But acquittal did not restore her. Not fully. After the trial, she and Emma moved to a larger home on the hill. The move itself is psychologically sharp. Before the murders, the hill represented status withheld. After the acquittal, Lizzie reached it, but not cleanly. She gained space, but lost belonging. She was legally free, but socially marked. The town did not forget. Children taunted her. Neighbors watched her. The case followed until her death. That is the final cruelty of acquittal without communal absolution. The law says you may go. The public says you may not return. So, what is the missing why? Not simply, why would someone kill Andrew and Abby Borden? That question assumes we know the killer. We do not. Lizzie Borden was acquitted. No one was convicted. The proper question is deeper. What kind of psychological system made this crime imaginable? The baseline was containment. An adult daughter living under the authority of a financially controlling father. A family with wealth, but not the social display some members desired. A stepmother relationship that appears to have carried emotional distance. A household structure around locked doors, rigid roles, and restrained speech. The dependency structure was financial and social. Andrew controlled money. Abby occupied the role adjacent to that money. Lizzie and Emma's future remained tied to Andrew's decisions. The disruption was not one event. It was accumulation. Years of resentment. Status frustration. Family conflict. Inheritance anxiety. The sense that life was being delayed by the people who controlled the house. The cognitive processing, if we examine the psychological environment, may have involved humiliation. Not humiliation in the public, theatrical sense, but the private humiliation of being an adult without full agency, of being socially visible but domestically contained, of being seen as respectable while feeling trapped. The behavioral evidence remains unresolved. There are suspicious details. There are inconsistencies. There are disputed interpretations. But there is no legal certainty. That is why this case must be handled carefully. The category is domestic containment violence. A case where the home is not just the setting. The home is the mechanism. The walls create pressure. The rooms hide the conflict. The family roles prevent honest release. And when violence happens, it carries the symbolic signature of the system that produced it. Andrew was killed in the sitting room. Abby was killed upstairs in the guest room. The father and stepmother were not merely removed, they were destroyed inside the domestic space they helped govern. That is the psychological center of this case. The killer, whoever it was, did not just kill people. The killer attacked the structure of the household. The Lizzie Borden case survives because it refuses to become simple. If you think she did it, the case becomes a study in repression, entitlement, status, and concealed rage. If you think she did not, the case becomes a study in gendered suspicion, class spectacle, investigative failure, and public mythology. If you remain uncertain, the case becomes something even more uncomfortable. A locked room inside American memory. A place where evidence, psychology, and folklore keep circling the same staircase. Abby upstairs. Andrew downstairs. Bridget in the attic. Emma away. Lizzie in the house. A family divided by blood, marriage, money, and silence. There's a reason this case became a rhyme. A rhyme makes horror easier to carry. It turns violence into rhythm. It turns uncertainty into something children can repeat. But behind the rhyme is a house. Behind the house is a family. Behind the family is a system. And behind the system is the question we are always trying to answer. Not just who did it, but why this house? Why this family? Why this violence? Why did everything that was hidden finally speak in blood? This has been The Missing Why. It's Christmas Eve, not the version people remember, not the one with music and warmth. The other one, the quiet hour after closing, when the town has already gone home. Inside a furniture store on Dillard Street, the lights are still on. Not bright, not inviting, fluorescent, cold, the kind of light that hums just enough that if you stood there long enough, you'd start to hear it. 4 people are inside. By the end of the night, all 4 will be dead, and one man will still be standing, bleeding, disoriented, alive, and that will be the problem. You're listening to The Missing Why. We don't just examine events. We examine the structures that make those events inevitable. Because what happens is rarely the full story. Today, a furniture store, a controlled environment, a family system, and a version of the truth that may have settled before the evidence ever did. Winter Garden in 1975 moves slowly, not because it has to, but because it chooses to. It's a place where routine becomes identity and predictability becomes a form of trust. You don't question the system because the system works. At the center of that system is Tommy Ziegler, a business owner, a husband, a fixed point inside a stable environment. His store isn't just a store, it's controlled space. Everything inside it has a place. The furniture, the lighting, the pathways people walk. Nothing is accidental, which makes what happens next structurally disruptive. Because when violence enters a controlled space, it forces a question. Who lost control? The first thing to understand is the sound. Gunfire inside a closed building doesn't behave the way people imagine. It doesn't disperse. It compresses. It hits walls, returns, overlaps itself. 30 shots don't sound like 30. They sound like chaos folding in on itself. Then silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that comes after something irreversible. When authorities arrive, the scene isn't just violent. It's layered. Bodies positioned in different areas. Some shot. Some beaten. A metal crank becomes part of the story. Not because it was meant to be, but because something escalated past control. And in the middle of it, Ziegler, alive, wounded, present. The human mind does not tolerate unresolved chaos well, so it begins to organize quickly, efficiently, sometimes prematurely. The prosecution's model is clean. This was contained. This was intentional. This was executed by someone who understood the space. That matters. Because if the environment is controlled, then the violence must be controlled too. And if both are controlled, then the survivor isn't random. He's central. So the system builds a narrative that restores order, motive, financial, location, personal, outcome, staged. It's coherent, which makes it believable. But reality doesn't always stay aligned with coherence. Over time, small inconsistencies begin to surface. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones. The kind that don't break a story, but start to bend it. Blood patterns that don't fully map. Timelines that feel compressed. Witness accounts that don't quite stabilize. Then decades pass, and something changes. Technology catches up. DNA enters the conversation. And now the question isn't what story makes sense. It's what does the physical world actually support? Because evidence doesn't care about narrative. It either fits or it doesn't. Here's the mechanism most people miss. Once a system commits to a version of events, it doesn't just store that version. It organizes around it. Every new piece of information is filtered. Does this confirm what we know? Or does it threaten it? And if it threatens it, it isn't always rejected. Sometimes it's reinterpreted, reshaped, absorbed. Because changing the conclusion doesn't just change the outcome. It calls into question the investigation, the decisions, and the people who made them, which raises the cost of being wrong. Now step back. Remove the narrative. Just observe the behavior. If this is a controlled act, it requires precision under pressure, consistency across multiple victims, and the ability to simulate chaos without losing control. If it's not, then what you're looking at is escalation, noise, disruption, improvisation, and the scene contains elements of both, which is where the tension lives, not in what's proven, but in what doesn't fully resolve. This is narrative lock, control preservation. A system identifies a stable explanation early. That explanation reduces uncertainty, and once adopted, it becomes resistant to revision, not because it's perfect, but because it's functional. This case isn't just about Tommy Ziegler. It's about the moment a system decides this is what happened. Because from that point forward, the goal is no longer discovery, it's alignment. And the longer that alignment holds, the more it begins to feel like truth, even if parts of it never fully fit. The lights in that store were left on long after the noise stopped, long after the bodies were found, long after the story was written. And maybe that's the most accurate detail of all, because even now, decades later, something about this case is still illuminated, not resolved, just visible. And the real question is no longer just who did it. It's what made one version of the truth stick. This episode examines historical criminal cases for educational and analytical purposes. Interpretations are based on publicly available information and are not definitive claims of guilt or innocence. What you just heard is a clean narrative. It moves with structure. It stabilizes itself. It gives you something to hold on to. But cases like this don't live in the narrative. They live in the tension between what makes sense and what actually holds under pressure. So the question now isn't just what happened in that store. It's why one explanation was strong enough to take hold, and whether it actually explains the behavior it's trying to contain. The central motive presented is financial, life insurance, economic gain, and at a surface level, that works. It's familiar. It's easy to process. It gives the violence a purpose that feels rational. But when you move from theory into behavior, that motive starts to strain. Because what's being proposed isn't a single act. It's not impulsive. It's not contained. It's a multi-stage event involving multiple victims inside a known environment with an alleged attempt to control the aftermath. That requires more than motive. That requires sustained execution under pressure. There's a difference between wanting an outcome and being able to carry it out. People have financial stress all the time. People think about escape, about relief, about removing constraints, but very few cross the threshold into coordinated violence, and fewer still do it in a way that requires composure, sequencing, and post event manipulation. So, if the financial motive is real, it can't be the whole story. It has to be part of a larger internal structure, something already active, something already building. Because money alone doesn't explain proximity. These weren't distant targets. This was his wife, her parents, people embedded in his daily reality. Violence at that distance inside a family system is rarely just instrumental. It's usually layered: resentment, pressure, identity conflict, perceived entrapment. Financial incentive might justify the act, but it usually isn't what creates the emotional conditions for it. Then there's the scene itself. Two different forms of violence: gunfire and blunt force. That matters more than it seems. Controlled acts tend to be consistent. They follow a pattern because consistency reduces risk, but mixed methods induce friction. They suggest either that the plan degraded in real time or that control was never fully established to begin with. And if control breaks down, then the original premise that this was a clean, financially motivated execution becomes harder to sustain. The most demanding part of the prosecution's theory is the idea of self-inflicted injury. Not just that it happened, but that it was integrated into the sequence. Because now you're asking one individual to manage multiple victims, maintain situational awareness, and then deliberately injure himself in a way that supports a narrative without collapsing the plan. That's a very narrow behavioral window. It's possible, but it raises the threshold significantly. Because now the motive has to justify not just violence, but precision under extreme stress, including self-harm. Now, invert it. If he didn't do it, the structure changes completely. There is no central motive. There is no need for consistency. The scene doesn't have to resolve cleanly because it was never controlled by a single actor. In that model, the inconsistencies aren't problems. They're expected. mixed methods make sense. Survival becomes incidental, not strategic. And that's where the case becomes difficult, because both interpretations can absorb parts of the evidence, but neither resolves everything cleanly. So, why does the financial motive persist? Because it compresses the case. It takes something complex and reduces it to a sentence. He wanted money. That's cognitively efficient. It gives the system something stable to operate on. It allows decisions to be made, verdicts to be reached, and narratives to hold over time. But efficiency isn't the same as explanatory power. A motive can make a story easier to accept without actually accounting for the behavior it's supposed to explain. And that's the distinction that matters here. Not just whether a motive exists, but whether that motive can carry the weight of what happened. Because if it can't, then what you're left with isn't resolution, it's alignment. A version of events that holds together just well enough to function, even if parts of it never fully fit. And that brings us back to the real question, not just who did it, but what made one explanation strong enough to become the truth, and whether that strength came from evidence or from the system's need for the story to stabilize. Because once a narrative like that takes hold, it doesn't just describe reality. The house didn't give anything away. From the outside, it held its shape. Clean lines, still windows, a driveway that led to a life that, by all visible measures, was intact. Nothing in the structure suggested fracture. Nothing in the appearance suggested pressure. Just a home existing within a neighborhood built on the assumption that things like this don't happen here. Inside, everything had been maintained, not perfectly, but consistently. The kind of consistency that doesn't draw attention. The kind that blends. Schedules were followed. Conversations happened. Days moved forward in a pattern that felt sustainable, even if it wasn't. Because not all instability announces itself. Some of it organizes itself, becomes quieter, more contained, more efficient at hiding. He existed inside that structure the way he existed in most spaces, without disruption, without resistance. He did not impose himself. He adjusted, matched tone, matched expectation, moved in a way that allowed everything around him to remain stable. That was the function, not to control the environment, but to avoid disturbing it. And over time, that creates something, not visibly, not immediately, but internally, a separation between what is lived and what is shown. The external version holds. It performs, responds, maintains, while something else remains unexpressed, unresolved, not because it cannot surface, but because surfacing would require conflict. And conflict is the one thing that cannot be integrated. And so it stays contained for a while until containment starts to feel like pressure, not explosive pressure, not volatile, but constant, quiet, persistent. At that point, the environment doesn't change, but the perception of it does. What once felt stable begins to feel fixed. What once felt manageable begins to feel permanent. And permanence without control becomes something else. A constraint. And when something is experienced as a constraint, the mind begins to search, not for expression, but for exit, not emotional exit, structural exit, a way to change the configuration of reality without confronting the elements inside of it. That's where the shift happens, not outwardly, internally. The problem is no longer something to resolve. It becomes something to remove. And removal does not require escalation. It requires decision. That is the part most people miss because they expect a buildup, argument, tension, visible fracture. But this doesn't build outward. It compresses inward until the decision is made quietly, without announcement. After that, everything moves in sequence, not rushed, not chaotic, just executed. And then something even more settling. And then something even more unsettling happens. Nothing changes on the surface. He speaks. He stands. He answers questions. The same tone, the same cadence, the same presence. Because the structure that maintained everything before is still intact. Which means the act itself did not break him. It aligned with something already in place. And that's where the real discomfort lives. Not in what happened, but in how little it altered the exterior. Because if the outside doesn't change, then the internal shift happened long before anyone was looking. And that leads to something harder to accept. This wasn't a moment. It was a progression that never became visible. A life maintained without disruption. A mind that avoided conflict instead of processing it. A structure that held until holding it became the problem. And when that threshold was reached, there was no explosion, no unraveling, just a decision. And the quiet that followed it looked exactly like the quiet that came before. Which is why no one saw it. Not because it wasn't there, but because it never needed to look different. The most dangerous fracture is the one that preserves the surface. Because by the time anything changes on the outside, everything inside has already been decided. Most analyses of Chris Watts stop at labels. Narcissism, psychopathy, deception. Those are descriptive, not explanatory. They tell you what it looks like, not how it works. The first mistake is assuming violence originated from aggression. There is no consistent evidence of dominance-seeking behavior, chronic hostility, externalized anger patterns. Instead, what you see is something more structurally dangerous. An individual organized around compliance, not control. But compliance is not harmless. Compliance, when overdeveloped, becomes a conflict avoidance system. Watts did not operate from a fixed identity. He operated from adaptive identity construction, meaning he becomes what the environment requires. He mirrors expectations instead of asserting preferences. He minimizes friction at all costs. This creates stability externally, but internally, it produces fragmentation. Because there is no central self-organizing behavior, only responses organizing it. In most people, conflict leads to negotiation, expression, confrontation. In this structure, conflict leads to delay and suppression. Decisions are postponed. Discomfort is contained. Tension is not released. It is stored. This is where people miscalculate. Because the absence of visible conflict is interpreted as peace. It isn't. It's accumulation without discharge. There was no explosion, no sudden loss of control. What occurred was a system failure. Specifically, the individual could no longer maintain multiple incompatible identities simultaneously. A husband and father, a new identity tied to an alternative relationship, financial and social pressure. These were not integrated. They were compartmentalized. And compartments only work under one condition. They must not collide. When collision becomes inevitable, the system must choose. Integrate, which requires confrontation, or eliminate one side. He does not have the psychological infrastructure for integration. So only one option remains. This is the pivot most people miss. The situation stops being experienced as, I am overwhelmed, and becomes, this configuration cannot exist. That is a radically different cognitive frame. Because once something is seen as structurally impossible, the solution is no longer emotional. It becomes mechanical. The behavior reflects sequencing, containment, absence of escalation. This is not an emotional discharge. This is execution under internal logic. He is not reacting. He is resolving. And that is the disturbing part. Because resolution implies the act aligns with the internal system's objective. After the act, he speaks calmly, engages with others, maintains composure. This is not shock. This is continuity. The same mechanism that allowed him to suppress conflict, maintain appearances, avoid confrontation, is still functioning. Which tells you something critical. The act did not break the system. It was produced by it. This is where the common narrative fails. People assume he didn't feel anything. That is not accurate. More precisely, he lacked the ability to process and express emotional conflict in real time. So emotion does not disappear. It becomes delayed, distorted, converted into non-emotional solutions. The underlying driver is not hatred, greed, or even desire. It is the inability to resolve internal conflict through psychological means, which forces the system to resolve it through external restructuring. That is the unseen mechanism. The danger here is not in people who express too much. It is in people who express almost nothing. Because expression gives you a signal. Silence removes it. The individual who never argues, never escalates, never disrupts, is not necessarily stable. They may simply be delaying every necessary confrontation until only irreversible solutions remain. This case is not about a man who snapped. It is about a system that avoided conflict, suppressed identity, delayed decisions, until the only remaining solution was one that required no negotiation at all. He didn't act because he lost control. He acted because control, as he understood it, could only be restored by removing everything that required him to confront himself. The house stood in Ohuvo, a quiet suburb just outside Nome, a place where sound doesn't travel far, where movement is noticed, where patterns settle in and stay that way. The kind of neighborhood where mornings repeat themselves. Same doors opening, same cars leaving, same lights turning off at night. Ordinary, routine, predictable. A family of 4 lived inside. No known conflicts, no visible instability. Nothing that suggested disruption. Nothing that suggested fracture. And then, in February of 2017, they vanished. Not loudly, not violently, at least not in a way the outside world could hear. Simply absence. No calls, no messages, no digital trace of departure. Their phones stopped where they last were. Their routines stopped mid-pattern. The cars were still there, cooling in the driveway, as if they hadn't been touched in days. Personal belongings remained exactly where they should have been. Coats hung, shoes aligned, objects undisturbed in a way that felt too deliberate. The house itself appeared intact. No broken locks, no shattered glass, no visible point of entry. But something was off. Not obvious. Not immediate. Subtle. The kind of subtle that sits in the air before you understand it. There were traces, small, fragmented, easy to overlook if you weren't looking closely enough. Dark stains, not pooled, not fresh, but present, embedded into surfaces where they didn't belong. Partially cleaned, wiped, but not erased. The kind of cleaning that suggests interruption or urgency. Not enough to confirm anything immediately, but enough to suggest something had already happened. Something contained. Something that did not leave the house. The family did not leave. They were removed from inside a structure that had not been forced open. No breach, no external disruption, which means the event did not begin as intrusion. It began as access. Access granted without resistance. Doors that were opened, not broken. Spaces that were entered without hesitation, which narrows the field because access requires recognition, and recognition lowers defense. As the investigation expanded, a connection surfaced. A relative, not distant enough to be irrelevant, not close enough to be constantly present. Someone who could arrive without raising alarm. Someone who could stand inside that house and not feel out of place. Someone who knew the layout, the entry points, the blind spots, the rhythm of the people inside. And more importantly, someone who carried a belief, not a suspicion, not a passing thought. Something fixed, something settled. Because what followed was not random. It did not unfold. It was constructed, deliberate, layered, already decided before it began. To understand this case, we remove a common assumption that violence requires immediate justification. In structured cases like this, justification is not reactive. It is pre-built, formed gradually, reinforced internally, left unchallenged long enough to stabilize. No external validation required. No contradiction strong enough to disrupt it. The offender believed something specific, that the family possessed items that rightfully belonged to him. Not suspected, believed. That distinction matters. Suspicion allows for hesitation. It leaves space for re-evaluation. Belief closes that space. Once belief is established, opposing evidence is filtered out, not ignored, reinterpreted. No forced entry, no immediate signs of chaotic resistance, which indicates the initial interaction did not trigger alarm. It was processed as safe, familiar, allowed. That moment matters. because the shift from safety to threat did not happen at the door. It happened inside, at close range, where reaction time shortens, where trust delays response. This introduces a specific mechanism: cognitive entitlement. The offender does not frame the act as violation. He frames it as correction. Within that structure, the victims are not seen as owners. They are seen as holders of something misallocated. And resistance from them is not interpreted as defense, but as obstruction, an obstacle to be removed. Once that internal position stabilizes, escalation becomes procedural, not emotional. There is no surge required, no loss of control, because the narrative has already aligned intention with action. The act is no longer a decision point. It is merely a step. The aftermath becomes critical. The attempts to clean, to reduce visibility, to manage the physical environment after the event. These are not disorganized actions. They are controlled, sequential. The behavior does not fracture after the violence. It continues, which indicates continuity of mindset, not collapse. That continuity tells us something precise. The act itself was not the peak. It was not the breaking point. It was one phase within an already active process. A process that began with belief and transitioned into enforcement. This is not impulsive violence. It is internally authorized violence. And internally authorized actions are resistant to interruption because they do not register as wrong within the This is not impulsive violence. It is internally authorized violence. And internally authorized actions are resistant to interruption because they do not register as wrong within the individual executing them. There is no internal signal to stop. So the relevant question is not, why would someone commit this act? It is what happens when a person no longer distinguishes between what they believe and what they are justified in doing. Because once that boundary dissolves, there is no negotiation, no recalibration. This case feels easier to explain, at least on the surface. There is conflict. There is escalation. There are decisions that appear deliberate. But that's exactly where the misinterpretation begins. Because clarity in behavior does not always mean clarity in motive. So instead of asking what he did, we need to examine how he justified doing it. Start with baseline, not just who this person was, but how they understood themselves. Because in this case, behavior is not random. It's consistent with an internal narrative. Some individuals do not organize their lives around stability. They organize around control. Control of environment. Control of perception. Control of outcomes. And over time, that control becomes identity, not something they use, something they are. To maintain that identity, the brain builds a supporting story, a framework where their actions are justified. Their perspective is correct. Their responses are necessary. This is not conscious manipulation. It is cognitive alignment. Reality is adjusted to preserve internal consistency. Now, introduce disruption. Someone challenges the structure, not just behavior, but authority. And this is critical. The threat is not experienced as disagreement. It is experienced as destabilization. Because if control defines identity, losing control feels like losing self. At this point, escalation becomes predictable, but not in the way people assume. It doesn't begin with violence. It begins with justification, reframing the other person, minimizing consequences, elevating perceived necessity. By the time the act occurs, it no longer feels extreme internally. It feels consistent. Several distortions typically appear in this structure. Entitlement framing. I'm justified in this response. Moral inversion. They cause this outcome. Control bias. I need to restore order. These distortions reduce internal resistance. They don't remove awareness. They remove conflict. This is where most analyses fail. They focus on intent. But in cases like this, intent is downstream. The real driver is justification. Because once an action is justified internally, execution becomes easier. Not because the person lacks awareness, but because the action fits their constructed logic. Now examine what follows. Does the individual attempt concealment? Maintain narrative consistency? Show selective acknowledgement? These are indicators of preserved identity structure. Unlike the previous case where the system collapsed, here the system remains intact, which is more stable and more dangerous. This case aligns with control preservation violence, where the act is not about emotional overflow, but about restoring or maintaining dominance over a perceived disruption. The individual is not reacting impulsively. They are acting in alignment with a self-consistent framework. The confusion in this case comes from overestimating emotion and underestimating structure. This is not someone who lost control. It's someone who believed they were maintaining it. That distinction changes everything, because it reframes the act from breakdown to enforcement. The most dangerous individuals are not always unstable. Some are perfectly consistent in how they think, consistent in how they justify, and consistent in how far they're willing to go to protect the version of reality that they have built. This was the missing why. If something felt off, it's because it was supposed to. Most people don't want clarity. They want coherence. Something that sounds right, even if it isn't. But the truth doesn't behave that way. It exposes. It disrupts. It forces you to confront the difference between what you believe and what's actually driving you. So before you move on, examine your own decisions. Not the version you explain to others, the one you avoid explaining to yourself. Because that's where everything starts. And whether you acknowledge it or not, it's already shaping what happens next.